Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Sam Gavis-Hughson in New York. Sam is an interview coach at his company, Byte, that specializes in helping software engineers excel at technical interviews. Sam, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited for you to be here. This is such an important topic. I know a lot of our listeners are very interested in the topic of coding interviews. I have to ask, from your perspective, what's sort of the hardest thing about interviewing for a job that's, to be a computer programmer?
That's such a great question because, at some level, everything is hard. But really the thing that I think that is most challenging for people is that it's just a totally different skill set. So it really comes down to when you're preparing for interviews and when you're learning how to interview, you have to actually learn something totally different. Your normal job skills don't really apply. And I know I was listening to a couple earlier episodes of this podcast, and I think that's true for a lot of other things as well, right? Where it's like interviewing, you may have the knowledge, but it's a different skill set entirely.
Absolutely. So what you're saying, I think, is that interviewing itself is different than what you learn when you learn to be a computer programmer.
Yeah, and I think that people often think that they're going to be the same because a lot of the interviews for coding jobs do actually involve coding, but it's still, you're in such a different context than you're used to for your normal coding job that even within that seemingly similar context, it's totally different.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that it involves coding because, sometimes people actually have to take coding tests while they're in the job interview. And I'm curious, what is a coding test exactly? Like, what does it look like? Is it on a computer? Like, what are kind of the details?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about this because this is really if I were to focus on one thing, this is the core thing that I focus on with people. And so you have a couple different sorts of coding tests. What I generally see people experiencing, and this has become super, super common recently, is that as the first stage of the interview, before you're actually going on site, before you're actually going and doing a real interview, you're doing a coding test online. And so that's going to be using a lot of the companies use this site called HackerRank, and there are a couple other ones as well. And that's going to be sort of a problem like, how do you reverse a linked list, or how do you do some sort of small self-contained project, and usually take 45 minutes, an hour, and you'll be doing it on the computer where you can actually run your code and you can test it. There will be test cases. And that's really what happens like before your interview. But then when you get into the actual interview where you're on site with the company and you're interviewing and you're doing multiple interviews actually at the company headquarters, that tends to vary a lot more. So what I primarily work with people at these sort of higher level companies, your Google, your Facebook, the companies that people really want to work at as software engineers. And what they tend to do is you'll be doing more coding tests, but they'll all be on a whiteboard generally. And so you don't have any of the tools that you're used to. You don't have Google, which for any of the other software engineers listening, we all know that we use Google basically constantly for our job. And so you don't have access to these resources that you're kind of used to having. And so that's a very different sort of process. And honestly, you kind of have to be prepared for both because it's likely that both of those will come up during the interview process.
That's interesting. When it comes to the whiteboard, I've heard a term called like stand up and deliver. Does that apply to when you're using a whiteboard?
I'm not actually super familiar with that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So I've just heard it used as a term that I think it often means presenting your thoughts for a sort of like a technology interview. But I think that's just kind of, some companies maybe use it as lingo to describe that you're actually going up to a whiteboard and kind of working out your thoughts there. But I've never done that. So
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would think about it would be almost like a math test that you did in grade school, where they're like, you have to show your work. Right? Like that's super important. And even if you don't get the right solution, you get credit for showing your work. And so that's really what you're doing on the whiteboard is you're showing them. So I guess this is kind of what you're describing. You're showing them your full thought process, and they're going to give you one of these, again, like that same sort of self-contained algorithmic problem. There are a bunch of, I know you interviewed Gail Lockman McDowell, who wrote Cracking the Coding Interview a while back, and that book does a great job of sort of overviewing what are the topics that these and types of questions you might be asked. And you're basically going to be given one of these sorts of questions, and then you'll be up the whiteboard. You'll have to explain your thought process and sort of talk through it as you do it. And that's part of what makes it really difficult as well, is you're trying to communicate clearly with your interviewer while you also solve a difficult problem.
So that makes me think of, are they just judging your thought process and the code that you kind of write down, or do they also judge your presentation skills in that moment?
I would say that generally speaking, and I can also speak a little bit from my own experience because I did work as an interviewer as well. Generally, what I would be looking for is primarily the actual work and the result, and hopefully that you're getting the right result. Like generally, I have some range of correctness that I'm looking for, and I'm like, if you got at least X degree of correct, or like 75% correct, that would be good enough, because I ask the same problem to a lot of people, and I'm really comparing you against the other people that I've talked to. That being said, we all know how important presentation is as part of just like communicating with someone. And it's a very human process. So I would absolutely say that I think that once your technical skills are strong, the communication becomes way, way more important, because that's going to be the differentiator between, like, if they're on the fence about you, having really good communication skills is totally going to push you over the edge, as opposed to the other person who didn't.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, the thing that's interesting, I've often heard this saying that, one computer programmer who's really good can do the work of like 10 bad computer programmers or something. So I could see how. Yeah, but that's so nuts, right?
It's insane. And I would probably place myself somewhere in the middle between the 10 and the 1 person, but I've seen those 1 persons before, and it's actually just insane to me how much they can get done.
Yeah, I'm sure it's from, the company's perspective, it's got to be hard to like judge that. I mean, it's hard to judge in an interview, but I guess that's where these coding tests come in, is that you can see more about how the person thinks and how they work, and you can compare them against other candidates.
Yeah, and I think that the coding tests also, one of the things that, and this might sound a little bit negative, but I don't mean it that way, is just that really companies are trying to weed out the bad people. Because it's worse having a person who really doesn't know what they're doing than, it's almost worse getting a bad person than missing out on a really good person, right? So these interviews tend to very much err on the side of, if we mess up, we're messing up in the rejection and not in the taking someone who we shouldn't have accepted. And unfortunately for us as the interviewees, they really can do that, because especially these big companies have such a volume of candidates that they can just be super, super selective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think too, as a candidate, it takes a little pressure off though, when you think about the fact that they're just trying to be sure you're not terrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe you don't have to answer everything 100% perfectly, to move forward in the interview.
Yeah, I always go back to, I'm pretty sure it was George Clooney who said this, that he was at the beginning of his career, he kept going out to auditions, and he kept failing his auditions, and he at some point changed his mindset to saying, rather than I want them to like me, to essentially saying, I know that I'm the solution to their problem. I know that I'm the right person for them, so I just need to show them that. And they want the same thing that I want, right? And the same is true with the employers. They want to hire a good candidate just as much as you want to get hired. So if you're a good candidate, just let that show. Let that come through. And they're not trying to reject you. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It can really be a partnership and a mutually beneficial thing.
I think that's a really good way to think about it. Well, I know your undergraduate degree is in computer science and you went to Princeton. And I know you've worked at a number of organizations as a computer programmer, including Yext and HubSpot. So I'm certain, I actually studied computer and systems engineering in college as well. And I know from my experience that you end up learning a ton of different languages
Yep.
in a short amount of time. Do you find from your experience that programming tests are different between different languages depending on what you're interviewing for?
This is a really interesting question because I think that something that comes up a lot and that people are always searching for is Java interviews or C++ interviews. And I was actually talking to someone the other day and helping him review a blog post that he was writing on JavaScript interviews specifically. And it really comes down to what kind of company you're interviewing for. So generally my experience and my candidate's experience has been the bigger the company, the less language, the bigger the company and the more general the role, I should say. Because to give you a counter example, if you were going to Google and you were interviewing as an iOS developer, you need to know iOS development, right? They're not hiring iOS developers who can't do iOS development. However, if you're going and looking at just like a general software engineering role for any of these large companies, they have so much proprietary stuff that they're doing anyway, and as long as you know how to program, it doesn't matter nearly as much as about what languages you know, and so the tests themselves tend to be much less language specific. Now, on the flip side, if you're looking at smaller companies, and if you think about it, with a smaller company, they don't have the resources to spend all this time onboarding you. They can't send you to like Facebook University. They can't spend all this time just like with you getting up to speed. They want someone who already has the exact skills that they need. And so the smaller the company, I find the more likely they are to test you really specifically on like your knowledge of a specific language, questions that are going to be specifically related to that, potentially even doing small projects, like if you were doing, again, going back to mobile development, creating like a single activity application, for example. And that's going to be more relevant in that case. But honestly, I would say general piece of advice for people is to ask your recruiter, because they're really there to help you, and your recruiter is very much benefited by you getting the job offer. And so they want to help you as much as they can. And so ask them, if you're not sure, what should I expect in this interview? What sort of things should I prepare for? And a lot of times they'll be able to give you a lot more insight on that.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. I'm curious, from what you're seeing, are there certain programming languages that are hotter right now than others? Like, are there certain, languages that companies are looking for more than other languages?
So I can't super speak to that because I tend to, when I work with people, it tends to be much more language agnostic. I will say that for interviewing specifically, the probably three languages that I see just constantly now are Java and Python, which is probably not surprising, and then JavaScript has become really big because of coding boot camps.
That totally surprises me.
So it's like there's a ton of people interviewing in JavaScript. I would recommend, if you're trying to choose, because there are people who are doing multiple languages, if you're trying to choose a language, I always say go with your best language. As long as it's a fairly normal language, or it's one that someone who understands how to program could read, go with that. Don't learn a language for the purposes of interviewing. Because I see a lot of people are like, oh, well, Python is the easiest because it's the most concise and most colloquial language. But that's really not necessary. Focus on what you're best at more than anything else.
Oh, that makes sense. Well, so as we are kind of focusing and getting ready for these interviews, how do you recommend that we go about preparing? I mean, these are really stressful interviews. I mean, we've got, these tests of our coding skills and then all the other pieces. Like, where should we begin?
So I generally think about it in a couple different pieces. And I mean, really, it breaks down to essentially three core components. There's the fundamentals, there's the actual like practice problems themselves, and then there is doing mock interviews. So I think that the fundamentals are probably the part that get overlooked the most. And I see a lot of people, they basically take the approach of, I'm just going to go and try and grind through as many practice problems as I can. And the idea is I'm going to try and memorize as many solutions as I can and then essentially hope that I see the same problem in my interview. And I understand where this is coming from, but I definitely don't recommend that approach. The way that I recommend that you think about it is, first of all, make sure that your fundamentals actually are strong. Make sure that you understand all of your core data structures and algorithms and that you just have that like foundation, because everything else is built off of that. And you may also find yourself coming back to this as well, because you may find that initially it's like you think you know something pretty well, but then as you're going through practice problems, oh, actually, I didn't know this as well as I thought I did. But I would start with at least spending a little bit of time going through those fundamentals. And then I would also do a mock interview or two fairly early on in the process, because that'll give you a much better idea of sort of where you are and if there are any specific things with that you're getting stuck on. So there's a really good service called Pramp, PRAMP.co, I think .co, that it's like peer-to-peer mock coding interviews.
Wow.
And so it's free, which is great. And it's, there are pros and cons to it being a peer-to-peer thing, but it's a really good place to, if you want to just do a couple interviews early on, check that out. And then when you come to actually doing the practice problems, which is part 3, I think it's really important for people to think about not so much what is the specific problem that I'm doing, but what are the patterns here? What are the sort of overarching patterns, and what can I take from this and add to my like arsenal? So what here am I going to be able to reuse? What here is something that I see coming up a lot? Honestly, what I would do is each time you do a problem, keep a list of like, here are sort of the core patterns, like, knowing how to iterate. If I was doing a linked list problem, just to keep the example simple here, like knowing how to iterate through a linked list, knowing how to get the nth item of a linked list, knowing sort of all these specific patterns that combine together to make my full solution, and sort of keeping a list of these as you go and updating it. That gives you like a really good place to focus, and knowing those sort of core patterns then apply to really everything, rather than saying, oh, I know how to do this problem, and this problem looks kind of similar, but I have no idea what to do here.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. And I just to add one small point to that, I think that I hear a lot of people really complain about this a lot, which I can understand because it is difficult. But I would encourage people to think about it as this is an incredible opportunity to earn 6 figures with just a bachelor's degree.
That's true.
Right? Like, it's going to take work, because if you want to work at one of these top companies, it takes a lot of work. If you don't want to do the work, there are a lot of companies that require a lot less effort to get into as well. So you kind of have to decide what your priority is. But if you really want to work at, like, this is sort of, I would consider this to be just like the price that you're paying to get that job at that top company.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's true. And also, it makes me think of, we paid a lot of money to go to college to get this degree. And I know this is work that we're putting in and not being paid for, but it's actually leading somewhere.
Yeah, and it's a skill that once you have it too. As long as you spend a little bit of time coming back to it every once in a while. Once you build up that initial skill, maintaining the skill is pretty easy. Mm-hmm. So it's just a skill that's going to help you throughout your entire career.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Well, so, this interview made me think of, I have a friend here in Memphis, actually, who's a computer programmer. And he went on a job interview where, he's very talented. He's been a programmer for years. He's taught computer programming. And he went on this job interview, and they wanted him to do a coding test. And they told him in advance, like, hey, we are, agnostic about the kind of code. Like, it's no big deal. and he's coded in a lot of different languages over the years. But then they gave him this coding test, and it was a very specific language that he's never used. And he kind of was like totally thrown off because he was like, hey, listen, I don't code in this language. I didn't claim to. And we agreed that you guys were sort of agnostic. And, I know for him, it was really tricky to figure out how to navigate that situation. I think the person who told him that it was an agnostic situation was one of the early on sort of high level thinkers. And then the person who gave him the really detailed coding test was someone different, like maybe more lower level in the process. But if we were to find ourselves in a situation like this, what advice would you have? How should we handle it?
Yeah, so that's a sort of tough situation. And I do think it ultimately comes back to, in this case, it sounds like it was probably a miscommunication because there are a lot of people in the hiring process who are non-technical. So they'll tell you one thing and then you get to the engineering team and they're like, no, we need someone who uses X programming language. And unfortunately, that's just the sort of miscommunication that honestly you probably see a lot. But in terms of actually, once you're in the situation, I think that it really comes back to your interview as a collaboration. So in so much as you can, it's okay to say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this. Is there a way that we could change this? Or is there a way that I could do this in a different language? I will say this too. When I was interviewing people for my old job, what happened in one case was that a guy came in and he was using, I think, C++ or something like that. And we were actually interviewing them. We were using a computer to do it. So we were actually having them code on the computer. And we just only had set up for a couple different languages, none of which were the ones that he knew. Right? So similar sort of situation. And what we did there, and we were actually in the same room with him, but we basically just, my interviewer and I just helped him with the language specific stuff. Because we're like, we know he knows how to program, and it doesn't really matter whether he knows the specifics. We'll help him along. We gave him a lot of sort of pointers on the syntactical stuff, but he still clearly knew his stuff and ultimately ended up getting a job offer. So I think it's a tough situation, but the key is just you have to make the best with what you have. And I think it's, I always refer people back to, it's sort of like a Stoic philosophy, you can only control the things that you can control. So how can you make the most of what you actually have? Right. And maybe it was just a miscommunication, and maybe they can just send you a test in a different language. Maybe the best you can do is just do the best you can with the language you have. But either way, I would say use the resources at your disposal to try and fix the situation as much as possible, and then do the best that you can with the situation that you finally end up with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I like that. I mean, really, I think it comes down to your attitude and, like you said, making the best of the situation, the best that you can, and knowing this kind of stuff happens. I mean, I think, job interviews are kind of a numbers game. You've got to do a lot of them to, get the job offers that you want. Yep. And it's both you practicing and becoming your best self, but it's also finding a situation that works for you, and people who actually want to hire you. But
I mean, it's just it's sort of like dating, right? You got to find your match, and you're probably not going to find your match the first time, but if you date enough people, eventually you'll find the right person.
Absolutely. Well, so, we've talked a lot about different languages. There are a lot of pieces to computer programming, and one of those is that it is just really constantly changing. I mean, constantly there are new languages coming out. Languages are evolving in different ways. I mean, if we studied computer programming in college, after we've left college, how can we stay up to date on our computer programming skills? I mean, not all companies are sending us to training.
This is a really good question. And it's funny because I love this question, but I also don't have a great answer for it. I love this because I'm always thinking about sort of learning and how can we learn better, and how can we, because that's really when I'm thinking about all this interviewing stuff, it's like I have the same information that everyone else has. I've worked with more people than a lot of others, so I have that perspective. But really what I'm trying to do is figure out how can I help people to learn this stuff more effectively. And I think when it comes down to like keeping up your skills and to this sort of side of the learning piece and, you know, learning new skills and just progressing your career, it's really, I think the best answer I can give is that you have to take a little bit of initiative. And because that's the thing, is that I think that a lot of times people love to complain about things and then not do anything. And that's fine, but you can't expect anything to change unless you do something. And so with an example like this, it's something that we absolutely can make a difference, and we absolutely can continue to develop our skills if we make a conscious effort to actually do that. Mm-hmm. So like to give you an example, at my old company, one of the languages that I did not know at all before I started was Go, which was originally out of Google. It's like Java or C. And I didn't know this language at all, but I sort of said, you know, our team is using this. I want to get better at this. How can I learn this? So I asked my manager to just buy me a book. I could have bought it myself. In this case, I was lucky that he was willing to buy it for me. But even if not, it was, you know, $30 or something. And I just devoted a little bit of time each day to actually going through this and trying to learn some of these skills and continue to progress. And then looking for projects as well that I could then start to apply these skills. So that's the other thing, is you can read all the books that you want, but that's not actually going to help. And so I think the ideal situation, and this isn't going to work for everybody, unfortunately, but the ideal situation is to find ways within your job to continue learning. Because there are some of us who love to code all the time. And I think there are a lot of people who maybe feel bad for feeling this way, but I'm certainly one of these people who it's like after a long day at the office, I don't want to really be coding more. Mm-hmm. So it's like, my thought is always, how do I kill two birds with one stone? How do I integrate this learning into what I'm already doing? And if you can't do that, then I think just coming up with small projects to do is really the best thing that you can do to keep your skills sharp. So say there was a great Medium post a while back where this guy was learning Ruby on Rails by doing a different project each week for 12 weeks. And one of the things that I took away from that was actually that you can do a project that's not this like big deal. You don't have to come up with some great idea for a project. You don't have to get thousands of users. You can build something just for the sake of learning how to build it. And honestly, you're probably not going to get tons of users for your side project unless you want to focus on the business part of it and the like building a user base and all that. Like that stuff is hard. But you can just make like a clone of Instagram, or you could make a clone of Reddit, or you could make a clone of Facebook, or pick something smaller. You can make just like a small blogging platform or anything like this, and just say, I'm going to pick a new technology that I want to learn, and I'm going to learn how to do it, and I'm going to build this thing using that new technology.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, I also like for people who want to do something with other people and who want to be social, I like things like looking up meetup groups that are specific to different technologies. Or I'm a big fan of these sort of like 48-hour launches that happen around the country, or actually they happen all over the world, where you come together for a weekend and you work on a coding project with other people. So I think it gives you a chance to have that project and the thing that you're focused on, but to also, you know, cross-pollinate with other people at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, to definitely try and connect with people outside of your own office.
Right. And I do think keeping up to date is really important. I know for me, when I did computer engineering and I came out, I was using a very traditional like software development life cycle. And when I talk to people now, they'll say, oh, we use Agile, you know, it's totally different. Like you couldn't understand. And I'm like thinking, I'm pretty sure I could. Like, you know, it's not so different. There are some fundamental things that are changing, but for sure, if you don't stay up to date, I think people will discount you very, very quickly. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah, and I would say just one more quick point on that. I think that the case where I see people failing to stay up to date the most is when they have a job working on some sort of legacy software.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be really, like for people, I don't want to say like change jobs, but I think it's something to be conscientious of if you're either at a job now or you're thinking about taking a job that's going to be primarily working on older legacy stuff. It can be really hard to then get out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just something to keep in mind is that like when you're looking at job offers too, is this job going to give me the opportunity to keep learning and progressing and, you know, give me a chance to experiment with new technologies? Because unless you're really, really dedicated to doing it on your own, and I think that, you know, doing hackathons, for example, is a great idea for a way that you can do this outside of work. But really the best way, if you can figure it out, is to do it within your job because you just have so much more capacity.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned changing jobs, and I'm curious, based on what you see with the clients that you work with, how frequently are people changing jobs? I mean, are they staying at a place for 10 years or 2 years, or what seems to be kind of the norm in computer programming right now?
I think we're pretty much in that like 18 to 24 months range now. It's like, it's especially with, it also depends on where you are in your career, right? Because the younger you are, the more I see people jumping around. So it's like, I feel like I tend to see people for their first couple jobs, it might be every year. After that, we're looking at more like maybe every 3 to 5 years. And then it's like, once people start to settle down, it becomes much more long-term.
Mm-hmm.
So it really just depends, but it is something where the timeline is so much shorter than at least how jobs used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And probably shorter than a lot of other industries as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I talk with job seekers a lot who they have a common experience where someone in their family who's older, often like their mom or dad, pulls them aside and gives them a lecture about how they're going to ruin their career and their life if they keep switching jobs so frequently. And I think sometimes in the case of like computer programming, it's important to look at what's normal for your industry. What are the people in your industry doing? Because if mom and dad are giving you advice, but they came from a different industry and they worked 30 years ago, their advice may or may not be relevant to what you're doing right now.
That's such a great point. I forget who it was now, but I just was hearing the other day, someone was basically saying, think about who it is that you're listening to. And think about whether, like, you can respect your parents and appreciate their advice, but also realize that their advice has nothing to do with your situation. And it's like, I think that I was hearing this in the context of business. Mm-hmm. So it's like, don't take business advice from, your next door neighbor, unless your next door neighbor happens to be a business person. Just because so-and-so says you should, have, sell t-shirts on your website or whatever doesn't mean that that's a good idea.
Right. That's totally true. Well, so we've been talking a lot about, people who come out of a college degree program where they come in with like a bachelor's in computer science. But what if we're listening and we don't have a college degree? Like, can we go to coding boot camp, or like what could we do? And will companies actually be open to us if we don't have a college degree?
So that's a great question, because this has become such a thing now, right? Like to go to coding boot camps. I actually have a couple friends as well who have gone through coding boot camps, and I think all of them do have jobs as software engineers now. So that can be like some anecdotal evidence for you. I did, though, on the flip side, see a video recently that was saying, I think it was Hack Reactor, their job placement rates pre-2017 were like 95%. Which is amazing. And then in 2017, it was like 50% or something like that. And so my general thought on boot camps is that boot camps, getting a job by going through a boot camp is not like an easy way out. It's not, I would not do a boot camp because it's easy. I would do a boot camp because you really love programming and want to become a software engineer. And so I think people, it's the same way we've seen this boom in people getting computer science degrees, and in large part because of the, huge salaries that software engineers can earn. And I think the same with boot camps is that all these boot camps are coming up because there's this allure. But what you see with boot camps is that it'll be usually probably a 12-week program. You'll learn how to code, but then there are so many boot camp grads and you don't have the same credentials as someone who did go to college, that you're not getting the same jobs. You're probably not going to get a job at Google. You're not going to get a job at Facebook. It's going to be a bit of a difficult job search process. And so what generally I tell people to expect to sort of have to take a couple jobs that you don't really love before you get to the point of being able to get those jobs that you really do like. So you can get jobs as a software engineer, but you're not going to get a job it's not likely that you'll get a job at a Google or a Facebook or anything until probably 3 or 4 years in.
That makes sense. Well, you mentioned that they have placement rates that they share. Do you find that the people who work at the coding boot camp, the people who conduct the coding boot camp, do they help to connect like the job seekers with the jobs, or do they just kind of report the placement rate back like after the fact?
Depends on the boot camp. I think a lot of them do, because I know a lot of them actually, the payment is structured around your future job. And so you're essentially paying 10% of your first year salary or something like that once you actually get a job. And so there is that incentive, at least for boot camps that are structured that way, there is very much that incentive to help you get the job. But on the flip side, there are so many different boot camps out there, and they're structured in so many different ways that it's impossible to say, on a broad level. I know the one that I have the most familiarity with is App Academy, because I had one friend who went through that a couple years back, and I have one friend who's actually going through it right now. And they do it as a portion of salary, and then they have resources and companies that they are connected with as well, so they will give you introductions and stuff like that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that's very cool. So it sounds like if we're picking out a coding boot camp, we ought to look at sort of those numbers and really take that into consideration when we're picking one.
Yeah, I would definitely be very careful when thinking about which coding boot camp, because it's become such a gold rush sort of thing, and there's so many really crappy sort of things out there that you just want to be careful that the one that you're doing is legitimate. So I probably shouldn't just randomly name names without doing my own research, but ones that I hear about a lot are App Academy, Hack Reactor, Flatiron School, ones like those.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, so we've talked a lot about sort of the technical side, but just if we were to kind of take a step back for a second, as computer programmers, when it comes to going to a job interview, where do you find that we're failing in the job interview? Where do we struggle, and what should we be on the lookout for?
I would say the number one thing that I see with people is, and this is more on the technical side, we can also talk about the non-technical aspects of this too. But generally where I see people failing is on the technical part. And there's sort of a couple, I guess there are two specific things that I see. One is that they're really interrelated. One is that people are trying to memorize solutions rather than actually learning how to problem solve. So you're going into your interview and it's basically, have I seen this problem before or not? And then along with that, when people haven't seen the problem before, they don't have a strategy for approaching that. And even if they sort of make some progress, they don't know what to do once they get stuck. And I think that the biggest thing is that the people who succeed are like, okay, I got stuck. Now let me get unstuck and continue. whereas the people who don't get stuck, or whereas the people who fail are the ones who get stuck and then sort of fall apart because they don't have a plan for this. And I talked about this in an email that I sent out a while back, but what it reminded me of was when I was a kid, I was in like a piano recital and I messed up like halfway through the song, and I tried to restart from where I was and I just got totally lost. And I couldn't do it because I'd only practiced starting from the beginning. And so what ended up happening was I actually went back to the beginning of the song and played the whole song again. And it was super embarrassing. And it's the same sort of with this, is like, we want to plan ahead and we want to assume that things are going to go wrong. And so what is our plan for that, rather than assuming that things are going to go right and then just falling apart at the first like speed bump.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, there's something that I have seen in tech companies more than probably anywhere else that I've seen lately. And I'm curious if you have seen this in sort of your experience, because I've never been on the other side of the situation. And that is, sometimes we go in for a job interview and like, let's say it's like an in-person interview and we meet a lot of people while we're there. We meet the hiring manager, we meet the HR person, we maybe meet the team that we're going to work with. We meet a bunch of people. And after we leave and we go home, on top of evaluating like our technical abilities and how we answered the questions, there's this thing that some tech startups in particular are doing where it's almost like they take a vote on the candidate and they decide whether or not they liked that person. Do we think this person fits in here?
Yeah.
Have you seen this before?
So I can't say that I've specifically seen it because obviously like the companies don't really, we sort of know that this is happening, but most companies wouldn't really be very explicit about it. And I think that, what we're really talking about here is culture fit, right? Which is just that sort of generic term that comes up all the time. And I would generally say that I think this comes back to the social skills aspect of it. This comes back to if you have really strong technical skills, they're probably going to hire you regardless, because more than anything, most companies want really strong engineers. But if they're on the fence, then this becomes a much bigger issue. It's like, do we want to work with this person? And so I think this is where once you have your technical skills in a decent place, it pays to think about, how can I work on my social skills? How can I even do little things like put yourself into uncomfortable situation, go to a meetup. If you're a introverted person, go to a meetup, go to an event and just like go up to someone and start talking to them. There are a million little things that we can do to sort of challenge ourselves and to just get better at this. I know for me, since I've been running my business now for 3 years, and a lot of that has involved doing coaching and doing basically just being forced to get on the phone with people. And it was something that was very uncomfortable for me at first, but gets better. Doing mock interviews is the same thing. It's like doing mock interviews, or even, one thing that a lot of people like to do is schedule your interviews so that you have a couple interviews with companies you're less excited about first, as basically a practice run. And it just gets you more comfortable in that environment. And more than anything else, the more comfortable you are, the better you're going to connect with the people there. And the less you're going to be, like, I think a lot of it is just being in our own head about, I'm really nervous about this interview.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But
I think that you give some good advice there. I do think social skills are important, and it's important to work on those things. I will tell you, I've gotten sort of the inside scoop from a couple of companies before, and their policy has been that if like one person didn't get along with you or didn't click with you, right, of the like 20 people that you met, they just won't hire you. And for me, I'll tell you, I think this is part of where unconscious bias lives.
mm-hmm,
I
I
think
would agree.
a lot of tech companies are made up of, people who are really similar. And if you go in and you look different, or you're a different age, or you're a different gender, or something is different, it is more likely that you're not going to click with somebody, that like they're not going to picture themselves having beer with you after work. I personally, and this is not, I won't stay on the soapbox for too long, but I really think companies need to not use such a simple way of judging. It needs to be, why didn't you click with this person? Were they not friendly? Did they not seem like they could do the work? Like this yes, no thing, we're not forcing ourselves to examine why we vote the person out. And I think with a person, it's really hard when they are perfectly capable and yet they're not being accepted into this environment just because maybe they're different in some way. So I do find that to be really tricky. I've only seen that though at like smaller startup tech organizations. Like I have not seen it at like big corporations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you do make a really good point, and I do totally agree with you that, we look at tech, and this is something that I've been sort of toying with a lot recently, is how can we as Byte by Byte as a company help in some way here. And I think, lack of diversity in tech is a huge problem, especially for women and especially for non-Asian minorities. Just because that's like how it's happened to be. But it's like, I don't know, I'm still trying to figure this out for us, but it's definitely a big problem. And it's like, it's something where on the one hand, I would say it comes kind of back to the Stoic philosophy of, you can't control it, so just do your best. But at the same time, that's not even totally true. Like there is stuff that we can do about this. And so I think we should all be conscientious of that. And, how can we in some way work to make this better? Or how can we, it's like you look at everything in society today, how can we look for opportunities ourselves to improve the situation for, the people around us? How can we identify situations that were not as they should have been and do something about that?
I totally agree. And it takes real initiative because a lot of times those are issues that are sort of like not our issue. Because if we work...
Oh, absolutely. That's what's so hard about it.
Right. Like if we work at the company, this is maybe not something we really care about because it's not something that impacts us. But I think if we want to really truly make a difference and make space for other people at the table, we have to be willing to talk about it, which has been a big lesson, I think, for me, just going through the course of this show. But anyway, Sam, this has been so helpful. I know people are going to want to go and learn more about your work and get your help. Where can we go to learn more about you and your company?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website is bytebybyte.com. It's byte-by-byte.com. You can also, a little bit easier to type in, you can type in dynamicprogrammingbook.com, and that'll take you to my free ebook that I wrote on dynamic programming. So for the non-programmers in the house, this is not going to be very interesting, but if you are doing programming interviews, that is something that I see a lot of people struggling with. So definitely check that out. That's probably the best place to reach me. You can also email me at sam@bytebybyte.com if you want to get in touch with me directly.
Excellent. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode today, please don't forget to help me out. Go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show. The more subscribers we have, the easier it is for other people to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.